Uh, Thank you for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk to you and share some of our experiences and hopefully hear about some of yours on this topic that I know is of interest to all of us, computational education of life scientists. So Carnegie Mellon has been doing a lot of work in training in computational biology over quite a few years at this point. And I mostly wanted to talk to you about directions related to training of experimental biologists. So we do have a number of programs aimed at computational biology specialists. So we have bachelor's, master's, and PhD programs there. But I want to talk about some more focused experiences I gathered might be more relevant to your immediate questions on providing more limited kinds of training, primarily aimed at experimental biologists. So in particular, one piece of this aimed at biology undergraduates, another aimed at biology PhD students, and how that interacted with some of my work as part of a much larger group of computational biology educators working more broadly on standards for the field. My general philosophy about this is that we need to balance some effort to try to develop programs in our own institutions and see what works for our populations, and talking to others, finding out best practices of the field and sharing what we learn as well as learning from one another. So hoping this talk will give some perspective on both aspects of what we've been doing there. And to motivate that, I want to start by mentioning a couple of important pieces of work that are not my own work, but were important in guiding my own thinking and that I would recommend others who haven't seen them check out. One of these is the Bio 2010 report. The other is a more recent paper, Barriers to Integration of Bioinformatics into Undergraduate Life Sciences Education by Williams et al. And I just want to say a little bit about these two reports. There's a lot more going on in the field than just these two, but I think they provide a nice bookmark over quite a few years of work in this area of how the field is doing and where it might be or ought to be going. So Bio 2010, for anyone who's unfamiliar with it, was a very influential report in the field of life sciences education. And although it's called Bio 2010, the report was actually written in 2003. So the name Bio 2010 was meant to be aspirational, where the field of life sciences education should be as of 2010. And there were quite a few recommendations to it, but one of the really important ones I'm highlighting here was that biology has become much more dependent, and again, this was as of 2003, it's accelerated quite a bit since then, much more dependent on quantitative analysis, modeling, prediction, what we would now call data science. And this led to recommendations that to prepare biology majors, it was necessary to have much more quantitative and computational education. So for example, a recommendation that students in biology should be adept at using computers, carrying out statistical analyses, doing programming. So this was a recommendation, again, from 2003 about where the field should be in 2010. And that's really what leads into why I bring up this other paper. This has been out for a few years as a bioRxiv preprint. I think it came out, actually published in 2019. But this paper was really tracking where the field of life sciences education is now, specifically with respect to bioinformatics. And this isn't my work, so I may not be doing the fairest summary of it. But the quick summary I would give is that they pretty much said very little has changed since the Bio 2010 report was written, at least as far as the minimum standard expected of all biologists. Very few programs are actually requiring any bioinformatics education or any serious training in the other aspects of computation, statistics, or programming that go into being able to use bioinformatics in practice. And they went beyond simply asking what had been done to looking at some of the reasons why there hasn't been more success, why it is that the field agreed almost 20 years ago that this was needed, but there hasn't been a lot of success in bringing it to student populations. There's a lot of data in that paper, and I'd highly recommend anyone interested in this field read the paper and see what their conclusions were. But they came up with some high-level categories. So this was based on a large survey of life sciences educators. And I'll just focus on a few of the top reasons that came up in their survey. The number one category is what they called faculty issues. And faculty issues was essentially that lots of programs said they didn't have bioinformatics education for their biologists because either they didn't have faculty qualified to teach it, or the faculty qualified to teach it weren't in a position to offer it, very often because they were too junior and they were placed in teaching service classes rather than being able to teach more in their area. So that was the number one set of answers, more or less, in that area. Number two was student issues, and student issues basically meant either they felt the students weren't prepared for bioinformatics content, they weren't coming in with enough training and didn't have enough opportunity in the curriculum to get it to benefit from bioinformatics, or the students themselves didn't want it. They resented being asked to take computational material. They felt that wasn't why they enrolled in biology programs. The third category was curriculum issues, and curriculum issues is something we've dealt with. I'm sure anyone working in this field has dealt with. And what it roughly comes down to in my summary is that if you talk about life sciences education to educators, almost no one will disagree that bioinformatics should be in the curriculum. But then when you say, okay, let's put it in, the answer is always, well, that's great, but nothing can come out to make room for it. There's nothing we can take out of the curriculum because everything already in there must be in there and it's full. So that basically is the core of what curriculum issues are. And there was more to it than that, but I want to focus on that because what they found was very consistent with my own experience and experience of colleagues at Carnegie Mellon. I think this is a general issue that maybe many of you can relate to, these particular topics. So that is kind of what was guiding the thinking of myself and others coming into this area of what needed to be done and maybe what some of the barriers were to doing that. And our own experience in Carnegie Mellon, as I say, was very consistent with that. We've been offering computational biology training for many years before I got to Carnegie Mellon, largely through the efforts of my colleague, Bob Murphy. So we've had a bachelor's degree since 1989, a master's since 2000, PhD since 2005. In a lot of ways, although it's more work to offer a computational biology degree, it's the easier problem to get one offered. No one really argues if you've got the resources to offer one that this is something the field needs. Bringing this training to biology undergrads was a harder problem. So we have had some benefits at Carnegie Mellon, one of them being that we actually required computer programming of all our science students since 1995. That's still an unusual thing, and I think it gave us some leg up. But it wasn't until 2010 that we began to require computational biology training of all our biology students. We've continued to improve on that, as I'll tell you about it in the remainder of the talk, including adding a statistics requirement just since 2018. And actually the slowest to adapt was PhD biology students. This was much more of a challenge because we can't control their prerequisites. They come to us with training from other programs, and there isn't any expectation in the field as a whole of what a biology undergraduate learns in this regard. So we couldn't assume anything. And of course, they're not spending that much time in classes, so that there isn't a lot of opportunity to introduce new material. So it wasn't until 2017 that we had really even an elective aimed at these students. And then we made that an optional pilot at that point and became mandatory for incoming biology students in 2018. Again, we've continued to improve. So that is roughly the history. And I want to tell you about more or less how we got to this piece of the story, the biology undergraduates in this one, and how my work with the International Society for Computational Biology, or ISCB, and others played into that. So to start with the first story, this was really before I had gotten involved with the ISCB efforts. We were talking to quite a few communities of bioinformatics educators. There have been many groups that have developed more or less independently, trying to do the same things, but we were largely working on our own and trying to put these practices together. So this is a very high-level overview of what our undergraduate biology curriculum looked like before we got to this point. It's, I think, probably a fairly typical biology curriculum. Students get an introductory biology class and a general math science core in the first year. After that, they're really getting into the traditional biology core, biochemistry, genetics, cell biology, lab classes. This is going on in parallel with various professional development, elective classes of various kinds. Most of our students actually take some kind of research. They're working in laboratories at some point during their studies, and then they have various opportunities for electives. I mentioned that they all take computer programming, but most of them in our experience don't want to take it and put it off as long as possible. So they're usually taking that in the senior year. Computational biology was an elective, and it was an elective that had really previously been designed much more for specialist computational biology students than for biology undergraduates. And any kind of more advanced computational biology or the kinds of maths that would go into preparing someone for computational biology was purely elective and generally something they'd be taking late in their studies, typically the senior year. So we couldn't really benefit from it as something to build off of. So we set out, based on our notion of what the field needed, to try to design a new class. And what I'm listing here are some learning objectives that more or less summarize what we were trying to do in creating a new class aimed at biology students. And I'm not going to go through and read what all of these learning objectives are. The talk's being recorded, so anyone who really cares can go back and read the individual ones. But basically, this was about trying to create a class that teaches computational biology useful to an experimental biology student. And as I'll tell you, and as I always told the students when I introduced learning objectives to them, those are the official learning objectives. But unofficially, there's really only one learning objective to this, and that is that we want them to learn what they need to know about computational biology to be the best biologists they can be. And in a lot of ways, that's very different than the computational biology you would teach to a computer scientist. Some of it is knowing about tools available to them. So sometimes that means knowing about an algorithm, knowing that sequence alignment algorithms are something you can use, or phylogenetics algorithms, knowing what those are. Sometimes knowing about data sources. So you're much more empowered to do biology research if you know what a sequence database is, or a database of networks and pathways, or expression data, or whatever. And some of what I mean by tools here is really more about ways of thinking than a literal tool. So being able to think in terms of statistical hypothesis testing, or mathematical abstraction, or computational thinking. So a lot of what we felt we could give to biology students was being able to reason in ways that were maybe not part of the traditional biology undergraduate curriculum. And that's something we tried to get across in this class. We also needed to teach them about how this could be applied to specific problems, and again, with a focus on problems that we believed would be important to the experimental biologist. So how does being able to think statistically influence how you design an experiment? That may be an obvious question to most of us at the faculty level, but it's not an obvious question to a student, and it's something that we felt they really needed to be taught and could benefit from being taught in the perspective of a class like this. How does knowing about the tools available influence your ability to test hypotheses, to make inferences from large data sets, to design or even think about using simulation in your work? So those are examples of how they would need to know about problems that can be solved. To some degree, that meant teaching them about computer science and statistics. So they had to know some things about how you abstract a problem. They had to know about some statistical tests, some standard bioinformatics methods, like a clustering method, let's say. And they had to know how to choose appropriate methods for a given problem and how to interpret the outputs coming out of those methods. So those are things that really required computational concepts and quantitative concepts that might not otherwise be in a biology curriculum. But one of the things that we figured out, and I think we had to emphasize to some of our colleagues that is maybe not obvious, is we ended up teaching a fair amount of biology and biotechnology to our biology students that they weren't otherwise learning. So if you want your students to understand what they can do with sequence databases, they actually need to know some things about sequencing. What kind of sequence can you do? What do you use a sequencer for? What are the limitations? What kinds of errors and artifacts do they have? And these are things that are not or weren't at the time part of a standard biology curriculum. So we spent a good deal of time actually teaching new biology in our computational biology class. But basically what that meant is we could come together with some idea of what we felt the students needed to know. And then using that, we could put together a more detailed course syllabus. Again, I'm not going to read all the individual things here. We roughly split this into two pieces of our class, a genomics and molecular biology half and a modeling and image informatics half, where each week or sometimes 2 weeks was covering a module of tools that we felt would be useful to an experimental biology student for their current or future work. As far as what that actually looked like in practice when we taught it, this is more or less a picture of the overall course design. A typical week, we would have 3 lectures, and sometimes these lectures were covering very basic concepts in quantitative or computational methods. So a Monday lecture might be teaching about statistical hypothesis testing, really very basic material about what is a statistical hypothesis test, how do you do it, what is a p-value, how do you interpret that, and some of the basic kinds of tests you would use. On Wednesday, we might be teaching them about some of the biology that goes into this, or we might be teaching them about some more specific bioinformatics topic. In this particular week, that would have been sequence alignment. So we were teaching them about what is a sequence alignment, what's a scoring function, an alignment algorithm, and how does that relate to the statistical concept. So what does it mean to get a p-value or an e-value of an alignment? And then on Friday, really bring that to a much more practical tool-based kind of knowledge. In this case, for that particular week, looking at BLAST, so different variants of BLAST, how you use it, how you interpret the output. And then that would segue into a recitation, really a computer lab session where the students would sit down, work with actual tools where they were using real data, applying the tools we had learned about that week, and solving at least some toy problems. Originally, we tried to do this with all web-based tools, so things that would be very accessible, wouldn't have to teach them any prior programming. We later decided we could be a bit more ambitious, added some basic Python scripting so they could do more advanced things in the data analysis. And then that would be the end of the instruction that week. And we give them a homework assignment where they would have a somewhat more involved set of things to do using the tools we had gone over in the lectures and the recitation that week. So that was more or less what this class looked like, and what we felt would be able to provide these students with the tools that would allow them to use bioinformatics in their own work, to have it as something they could bring to subsequent classes in the curriculum, to their lab research, and to whatever they're doing next with their studies. But of course, as you probably all know, and as that barriers paper I was telling you about emphasized, creating the course is just the first step. We need to get it into the curriculum. We need to ensure that the students are coming to it with enough preparation that they'll be able to follow it. And we need to ensure that there are opportunities for them to make use of it later. We don't want to give them material they'll never use again. And that in some ways ended up being the harder problem than actually creating the class. So I want to say just a little bit about our experience, some of those challenges that I mentioned before and how they manifested for us, at least what worked for us in getting around them. So as of 2010, so at this point more than a decade ago, but when we got this as a required class for all our biology students, this was what our curriculum ended up looking like. And it took a movement on a number of different levels to actually make this something workable. One of the things we had to deal with was the general math science curriculum. So basically the general math and science core. And this was actually the crucial thing for solving the problem of how do you make room for it in the curriculum. Now, I can tell you what worked for us there. It may not be the same things that worked for you or will work for you if you're still working on this problem. But hopefully there's something of value in our experience. I will say we had a couple of nice advantages there. One of our advantages, which I I think you have as well, was great leadership there. At the time, the biology department was headed with a really fantastic department head, a very visionary leader by the name of Elizabeth Jones. She was very supportive of this, and that made a huge difference in making this possible. Uh, Another thing that I think helped for us is that myself and my co-instructor, although we're computational biologists, we were in the biology department, so we were biology faculty members. And I think that did make a very big difference in getting the buy-in of our colleagues. We talked to them regularly. We knew what was in their classes. We were in many discussions on curriculum. And I think it helped that they knew that their students were also our students, and we all wanted what was best for them. And this is something that I think even if you're not in the biology department or the department you're working on, you need allies in that department. You can't just bring something to them and say, we think this should be there. It needs to be an effort that has buy-in locally. But as far as what that buy-in looked like, the argument that ultimately worked for us, that again may not fly for anyone else, really ended up focusing on other aspects of the science curriculum. In particular, what I focused on, I think was the argument that won the day for us, was the chemistry in our curriculum. Because at the time we were trying to do this, our students had no required computational biology, but they were required to take 7 semesters of chemistry. So 2 semesters of general chemistry, 2 organic chemistry, general chemistry lab, organic chemistry lab, and physical chemistry. And when I pointed at this and said, okay, we all agree you need to know chemistry to understand biology, but can you really tell me the 7th least important semester of chemistry is more important than the 1st semester of computational biology? I think no one could really maintain that that was the case. And that doesn't mean that we got rid of anything important in chemistry, but we did prevail on our colleagues to remove one of those chemistry classes and move the important material into other classes. We actually ended up removing physical chemistry as a requirement, moving some key topics into other chemistry classes and into biochemistry. And I will say not everyone agreed with that. There were colleagues of mine who years later still complained that the students were not adequately prepared in physical chemistry, but it got computational biology into the curriculum. So I took it as a win in that regard. So that is one of the things we needed to do. Another thing that ended up being a challenge was the mathematics preparation of the students, because computational biology or bioinformatics really depends on some math background, and one semester of computational biology was not enough to really give them the bioinformatics and the background they needed to understand it. And really what they needed more than anything else was some basic probability. So that's really crucial. And then we could build on that and teach them what they needed to know about computational biology. And there we needed to get a little creative. So our students, probably like many biology students, spent their first year taking calculus. So that was the math they took. There was no room for anything else in the curriculum math-wise, at least in the first year. And we wanted to get the computational biology in there early. And so we ended up needing to talk to our math colleagues and come up with a creative solution there, because yet another problem with biology students is that many of them are pre-med, and you can't change anything that makes the curriculum unsuitable for pre-meds. And that meant they needed to take 2 semesters of calculus because, for whatever reason, medical schools think students need 2 semesters of calculus. And we wanted to prevail on them that, sure, calculus is important, but probability is important too. And we need some of that in the first year. And what ended up working for us was that we pretty much prevailed on our math colleagues to make a flavor of calculus 2 that had some probability in it, that was using calculus to teach some probability. And that got them the preparation they needed and did the all-important thing of allowing them to keep calling it calculus, so medical schools would be okay with it. So that's another case of being a little creative and working with our colleagues to find a solution that worked. But that ultimately allowed us to get computational biology in the curriculum and to put it early enough that other classes could assume students had taken it, could build on it in things like genetics, that students would have it for their research. And that was, I think, one of the things that actually made this palatable to our biology colleagues, that sometimes their students could teach them something they didn't know about bioinformatics that was useful in the research lab. So that more or less is the story of how we got computational biology into our curriculum. That, though, is just part of the story, because this was a large effort of a number of years to do this, and we knew many of our colleagues were dealing with similar issues. And so we felt it was important to learn from what others were experiencing and to try to share some of our experience. So that's really where I became much more involved in these various international efforts at computational biology education, and most prominently with the International Society for Computational Biology, or ISCB. There have been a series of reports and papers that have come out of curriculum efforts that I and others have been involved in there over the years, as well as now a series of meetings. 2 of them have been run, another one is planned for later this year, to really keep building on these efforts of how to set standards and practices and how to help other trainers bring bioinformatics training into various kinds of curriculum. And I want to say a little bit about that effort, where that is and where we hope that's going, because a lot of what we figured out in trying to go through this process locally is that we could have benefited a lot more from other people's experience. Maybe others could benefit from ours. So this effort had actually started focusing much more on the specialist computational biologists rather than the life scientists, although it broadened over time as we talked to more and more people. So the earliest version of this effort really started from something called the Curriculum Task Force of the ISCB Education Committee. And the original Curriculum Task Force was Fran Lewitter, the longtime head of the ISCB Education Committee, Lonnie Welch, and myself. So we started this task force to try to figure out what is the consensus of the field? What do people know about how to teach computational biologists? And how can we all learn from one another about how to do that? And the way we set about doing that initially was doing a series of surveys to try to figure out what is the consensus or what are the standards of the field. One of these was a survey of employment ads of people trying to hire computational biologists, one of bioinformatics core facility directors, so people who employ large numbers of computational biologists and may have an idea of what they think is needed in the training there. And that led to a lot of specific keywords that came up describing areas of expertise that they felt were needed or that the job ads felt were needed that we could group into some general categories. And the third survey was of existing curricula. So this ended up being a much larger number of programs than I would have guessed existed. I forget the exact number, but well over 100 different programs at different levels in computational biology or bioinformatics. And again, that led to a lot of keywords of particular classes offered in different programs that we could group into some rough categories describing what different programs were doing that we're trying to teach in this area. And then we hoped we would be able to look at this, see what was in common, and come up with some guidance for the whole field. What does the rest of the field think is the consensus of how we should be teaching this area? And the very short summary of what we learned is that there wasn't any consensus. You couldn't look at any 2 programs and find really anything in common. If you picked any 2 random degree programs, there might not be a single class in common between them in what they felt was necessary to train a computational biologist. If you looked at a degree program producing people who might be hired as computational biologists and an employer trying to hire them, there might be no agreement on what those 2 different perspectives offered on what it actually meant to be a computational biologist. And so we kind of needed to change our focus. We realized this was a much harder problem than we had appreciated. And so we decided that it was premature to be talking about best practices in the field because the field didn't know what the best practices were. We could provide some framework for trying to understand the space of programs and needs, but we really needed to learn more and get more input from the community if we were going to be able to do anything useful with this. So that became the mission of this curriculum task force. We added a number of other members, and this is a task force that kept growing over the years, adding more people, and eventually it was just dissolved because it was a huge community of people who were participating in different ways. It was no longer really a task force. And some of the new members we added brought in really expertise in pedagogy that the original members didn't have, or at least I didn't have, and had some great ideas for how to do this more effectively. And one of the big ideas they brought in was this notion of core competencies, that essentially we needed some framework for describing, at least at a high level, what are the areas of expertise that are needed by someone working in bioinformatics. And that can be working as a specialist computational biologist. It can be working as a life scientist who needs some bioinformatics. It can be working in another capacity, such as a genetic counselor, a bioarchivist, and so forth. But the committee came up with a first pass at these competencies. I'm listing these here. I'm not going to read off what all of them are, but you can see that these are fairly high level kinds of descriptions of areas of expertise. So competency A was an ability to apply knowledge of computing, biology, statistics, and mathematics appropriate to the discipline. So it's not prescribing in any great detail what that means, what kind of biology, what kind of mathematics, and that becomes an issue, trying to get the right level of abstraction there. But essentially, we could come up with a set of these that seem to describe very roughly what all of the people in this committee thought were needed one way or another for different kinds of populations. The other big idea they introduced at this point that we found really useful in being able to make practical use of this was the idea of thinking in terms of personas. So a persona is a kind of hypothetical person who has some need for training in the area. And the original personas consisted of three kinds, what we call the bioinformatics user. So a bioinformatics user would be someone who makes use of some bioinformatics tools, more or less in the context of doing what is not primarily a bioinformatics job. So this might be an experimental biologist who needs some use of tools, but is not really a bioinformaticist as their primary area. The bioinformatics scientist was someone who needs more bioinformatics in that they're really doing biological discovery with bioinformatics as their primary tool. And what we called a bioinformatics engineer was someone who's really developing the tools. And those are the original three personas. And to go into a bit more detail, let me show you a more refined version of the bioinformatics user persona. So this was a hypothetical person. I'm not actually sure who on our team created this one, but this was Angela, our bioinformatics user persona, and you can read more about this in one of the papers that I showed on a slide a few slides back. So Angela, this hypothetical bioinformatics user, is an undergraduate biology student. She was planning to get an MD, but she got some experience with research, decided that maybe she really wants to do research and get a PhD in biology. She knows she wants to do primarily experimental biology and to be running wet lab experiments, but also recognizes that she has some need for statistical analysis, data science experience, and she wants to be prepared to grow with the career over decades of work in this area. Based on that, we can come up with some idea of what a day's work might look like for Angela, how that's distributed between different kinds of computation, as well as other things like what are her goals, what are her skills coming in, what does she want them to be coming out of her efforts, and so forth. And that gave us a way of thinking about different populations that would come together to work in this area. And a lot of understanding why there was so little consensus early had to do with this question of personas. So many people had bioinformatics training programs that were really aimed at different personas, and understanding that helped us understand why there were differences among programs, as well as what the commonalities were and how we can design programs that serve different kinds of personas. So that really prepared us to get to what we would call phase one, the original competencies and personas, and get us ready for phase two, which was really trying to get to a community consensus. So from this initial construction of this idea of competencies and personas in the field, we then set out to learn in much more detail what other educators or people who felt they needed education in this area thought should be offered. We ran a lot of workshops at ISNB, so that's the main meeting of the ISCB, other meetings affiliated with ISCB, and other initiatives at bioinformatics training. So Goblet is another one of the major international groups focused specifically on training in this area. We had lots of workshops to sit down with people, explain to them what we had done, and try to get feedback. So refine the competencies, refine the personas, figure out that some people wanted other competencies, they wanted to split competencies we had, merge other ones, change the wording, add in new topics. And essentially what we ended up with this was a number of revisions to the original plan. One of this was to recognize that there really was a problem of getting to the right level of abstraction. Competencies as we originally specified them were really too vague to be practically useful in developing a class or a curriculum. And we came up with a way of refining that using what's called Bloom's taxonomy, which is basically just a way of talking about degrees to which you need to master a given competency. So you can have knowledge of a competency, so be aware that this is an area of study that exists, be aware of some facts in it. You can have comprehension, you can know how to apply those facts to a practical problem, how to analyze or think critically about them, how to integrate this with other areas, or how to create new methods in the field. And these would correspond to different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. That gave us a way of thinking about how different personas might use the same competency, but need very different levels of training in it. We also, through this experience with these working groups, expanded to a broader set of personas to better capture variation across training needs. And we gathered experiences on how these competencies were used or could be used in developing programs, refining them, evaluating them, assessing them, and so forth. So this was a very useful exercise in getting us to what we call the phase 2 competencies, a refined list of competencies, as well as a refined list of personas and how these personas would differ from one another in the competencies they needed, the level at which they needed them, that could get us closer to something that was really practically useful to people working in this area. Now we've continued from there. Largely that was what became the subject or one of the subjects of the Bioinformatics Education Summit meetings, which started in 2019. These were really international meetings specifically on bioinformatics education. And one of the topics at each of these meetings has been this question of what are the standards of the field, usually focusing on this competency framework, what we can do with it, how we can improve upon it. And that led to yet another refinement of these competencies over a course of these meetings, to refine the collection of them, to assign to a further expanded list of personas, and to once again try to deal better with that question of the level of resolution. So there's this continuing problem. If you go into too much detail, it's just too complicated and too messy to be useful. You can't get any agreement on too fine a detail of what people need to know. If you have too little detail, it's not useful. It's not helpful to say that every bioinformaticist needs to know biology, because of course they need to know some biology. And a further effort in the latest version of this to get at this is the notion of KSAs, or knowledge, skills, and attributes, which is basically a way of trying to get a little more detail of what you need to know about a competency, what you need to be able to do with it, and how someone with the competency behaves. So we could get yet another refinement of the competencies, and we could get some additional kind of metadata associated with them that would help people reason about what a competency needs and what you might put in a class teaching it, let's say. So for example, the new Competency A, work at depth in at least one technical area aligned with life sciences, might have knowledge of the central dogma as one piece of knowledge you would need in the field. It might have an ability to, let's say, design it and plan experiments as one of the skills you need to be working in bioinformatics there. It might have the behavior that you need to consider broader impacts of your research. And it also could have negative attitudes, like you don't defend the discipline to the exclusion of others, in a sense, a flip side of saying you need to be interdisciplinary if you want to be a bioinformaticist. So that's an example of how we get into greater depth in this area. And that's more or less where the competencies stand today. So the ISCB education community continues to work on this. I would have hoped I could share with you a new manuscript telling you all about the final version of this and lots of other useful information to go with it. That's actually being finalized right now. We're hoping to have the manuscript submitted very shortly and have something available by the summer, but that's in preparation, so I can't share that yet. But the plan is to release a new manuscript describing this new set of competencies, but release it also with a lot of extra guidance. So computational tools that let you map a curriculum to this, guidelines to teach about some of the background on ideas of pedagogy that were useful to many of us in working with these guidelines, and case studies of how they've been used for different kinds of areas or could be used. So all of that, like I say, I wish I could have shared that with you today, but it'll be coming soon. And anyone's free to write to me, and I hope I'll be able to share it with you as soon as that's available, or keep an eye out for it. We are continuing community outreach, so there is a plan for a third bioinformatics education summit. Again, I don't have the final details on how to get involved with this, but anyone who wants to write to me, this is a community that can always use more participation. This will be an online meeting planned late spring or early summer, and this is something I found the previous two meetings really very useful meetings. There's a lot of time in workshops. It's not just sitting looking at talks, it's really talking to people, working, doing practical work that feeds into these kinds of efforts of the community. And we're also planning a new program to try to bring some of the community consensus to the field now that we believe we're in more of a position to say what the community consensus is, through a program of degree endorsement that we're also hoping to roll out soon. So the plan is to roll this out later this year, so this summer, where people will be able to submit degree programs to the ISCB and have these reviewed, evaluated, and hopefully either endorsed by the ISCB, so we can say this is a program that our experts believe is credible according to the standards of the field, or give feedback from expert reviewers saying what we would recommend you do differently in this program if you would like to have it brought to the standards that we would be endorsing. So that was more or less what's been going on with the education community. And that's summarizing quite a few years of work at this point of quite a few people. But that is kind of the quick summary. And that leads me back to what we're doing with this kind of knowledge, because having been through that process and seen what many other educators are doing puts us in a much different place to revisit some of the questions of how we deliver this in our local institution. So for example, we can revisit our undergraduate program design with this kind of framework in mind, with our knowledge of what we can do here, and try to think about what we might do differently, or how knowing more about what the field is doing can refine our notion of what we should be doing in our own community. So we can go to our learning objectives, we can go to the competencies. This is something we actually did with the version 2 competencies. So I've just reproduced these here, and I've added a color code to kind of distinguish them by broad categories of biology, computational biology, computer science, or professional development of various kinds. We can do a mapping between them. So say which of our competencies match to which of the learning objectives in our class, see what kind of mapping we get and what is present, what is missing there. We reason a bit more about what's going into each element of that mapping, but also reason about what's covered in our class, what is covered elsewhere in our biology curriculum, and what's missing. So what doesn't seem to be covered that we think based on the community consensus should be in our curriculum. And we can look at those competencies that seem to be missing and start saying, okay, what do our students need? What do the personas we're trying to train need? And how can we refine our curriculum to bring that in? So we can see that this competency K that has to do with construction of software systems wasn't anywhere in our training. And we can say that's something a biology student really doesn't need at a very high level. They need to know what a software system is, but really they don't need more than simple scripting. And so we can put a little bit into refining our class to improve there. Other things like knowledge of ethical and social issues of bioinformatics, being prepared to undertake continuing professional development on their own. Maybe those are things that we can't necessarily put in our class, but we can look for opportunities to put them elsewhere in our curriculum. So we can start to reason about the kinds of changes we would want to make, maybe moving computer programming earlier so we can do a little more with bringing systems knowledge into the class, changing our topics within computational biology a little. So for example, bringing in Python programming so we can get them to a somewhat higher level of competence in being able to develop their own software, even if it's still a fairly basic competence for the biology students, as well as talk with our other colleagues about areas that we could see going into professional development opportunities, such as department seminars and colloquia, to maybe educate them better about some of the social and ethical issues, for example. So that is a way we can bring this into refining an existing program. And we can also bring that knowledge into designing new programs. So I mentioned earlier, we had also tried to do something very similar for our biology PhD students. And because we were doing this much later, we were in a very different position in accomplishing that, in having a lot more knowledge of how other people are providing this training and what they're doing in the field. And so we could take a very different, I think in some ways, much better approach to this than we had done originally with the undergraduates. So the big challenge with our biology PhD students, as I mentioned before, is we don't really control what the training they have coming in. Mostly they're biology undergraduates or something similar coming in. Most biology undergraduate programs don't train them, or at least in a consistent way, in bioinformatics. So we pretty much have to assume they're coming in with no prior training. And most of the time they're in a PhD program, they're doing research. So there isn't a lot of coursework. It's almost all in the first year in parallel with research rotations. We simply can't grab a lot of their time to teach them bioinformatics. So we ended up needing a somewhat different approach, but I felt we also knew a lot more about how to use our time effectively. So we could come up with some goals for this cohort, and they're actually fairly similar to the goals we had for the undergraduates, that essentially they should know things about bioinformatics and related quantitative topics that will help them be better experimental biologists, but with a harder set of constraints on what we can assume coming in and what opportunity we have to teach them, that pretty much ended up saying we can only grab a tiny portion of their first year of training, what amounted to a little more than half a semester for bioinformatics, to try to give them what they needed to at least get them started in lab work and give them a foundation they could build on their own in subsequent work in their own specialties in their research labs. But being able to think about what our personas were, so what we're training a biology PhD student to do, what the competencies were, and how other people in the field think these sorts of personas might need to benefit from these competencies, helped us focus on some areas where we really felt we needed to be the ones giving them the training, develop a set of learning objectives that could be more focused on what we could provide in a limited amount of time that we felt those students needed, and come up with a course that we felt served their needs. The course design we ended up coming up with was fairly different than what we had for the undergraduates. It was focused much more on working with real primary data and working with co-instructors who are laboratory scientists in our program. We ended up with a set of modules. Each module had an experimentalist co-instructor, and each one was meant to introduce one biological topic and one kind of biotechnology or data topic. And in the context of those, introduce a few areas in bioinformatics that would be cross-cutting across different biology and biotechnology topics. So we could start with module 1, that was introducing RNA-seq in the context of developmental biology with Veronica Hinman, an Evo-Devo person in our department. And then she could come in, teach them about some of the basic concepts of developmental biology and expression analysis, what questions they were trying to ask in their laboratory. I could come in and teach about some of the computational tools relevant to those questions, how to do differential expression analysis, clustering, and so forth. and then bring that into workshops. In this class, we ended up working with R rather than Python. So anyone unfamiliar with it, R is a language widely used in statistics and bioinformatics. It's not as good a teaching language, but it's somewhat more practically useful for some of the questions we were asking, and really sit them down in the laboratory and ask practical questions with real data from the Hinman lab, where they could walk through and do a real RNA-seq analysis, a real clustering analysis, and really try to ask questions about the data coming from those labs. And then we could repeat this with a module on DNA-seq and microbiology, where we could reuse some of the same computational tools as well as introducing others. And then again, an imaging module focused on neuroscience, an electrophysiology module, each bringing in some more bioinformatics and reaching back to the bioinformatics at earlier steps. So as we taught this, we would be able to bring in some basic bioinformatics and biostatistics concepts. So things like, what is statistical hypothesis testing? What are some basic statistics, alignment scores? So how statistics applies to a topic like sequence alignment, and then how some of the same concepts in statistical hypothesis testing apply to a very different problem like genetic association testing. And we could do the same with other tools like clustering, classification, dimensionality reduction. And by the end, try to give them a set of concepts that they would be able to apply across different fields and generalize to new fields we haven't taught them. So we could show them, how, again, how clustering applies in the context of finding modules of co-expressed genes relevant to developmental biology, to finding neurons that seem to be acting in concert in performance of a behavior of a mouse that has a probe in its brain measuring electrical activity in the brain, and work through various exercises and data analysis from these data sets with them. We ended up switching from working directly in R to using Jupyter Notebooks. So for those unfamiliar with these, Jupyter Notebooks are one of the things I learned about working with this bioinformatics education community that turned out to be really useful for us. It's a kind of electronic lab notebook where you can associate data, code, as well as didactic material in a single notebook, and students can go in, run the code, modify it. You can give them incomplete code and have them complete it. You can give them code that needs to be edited or is broken in various ways, and really do something creative with what they're getting there. We added in other kinds of tools for technology-assisted learning. This is an example from an initiative at CMU called the Online Learning Initiative, where they have something called a cognitive tutor, which is a kind of electronic textbook that combines didactic material, integrated exercises that sort of customize the training to a student's understanding, and integrated assessments that let us as instructors send them off on their own to work at their own pace, but let us track their progress while they do, and ultimately get to a class that we could really assess in some at least semi-rigorous way to see if the students are actually learning what we wanted them to learn. So that shows how at the end, even with a fairly small cohort, we could have a very different experience offering this kind of training than I and my co-instructors had years before we knew more about what was going on in the other field. And that's a lot of why I like to get out and talk about this and hear what other people are doing in this area. So just to wrap up, because I know we are short on time here, there's now a large community of computational biology educators asking very similar questions and dealing with similar challenges. Each of us has some pieces of the puzzle of how to do this well. I think it's great that we can talk to one another. We hope this framework of competencies, personas, and so forth is helpful in sharing our experiences and getting some abstraction, some framework where we can talk about commonalities, start to recognize how to use those, and how to serve our different training needs. But this is an ongoing process for many in the international community that really needs continuing participation and refinement. I'll just close by acknowledging many people who contributed to this work, both people at Carnegie Mellon who worked with us to develop this material, especially my co-instructor, Bob Murphy, on the original computational biology class, my TA, Christina Arkurtava, from the PhD class, and my co-instructors there, and many people who contributed as part of this curriculum subcommittee and various other larger efforts that are involved in providing this kind of training. And thank you to all of you for your attention.